The sound of an axe biting into wood echoed through the cold darkness, and Violet Thornton's breath came in ragged clouds as she struggled to split another log before the sun crept over the horizon. She had been at it for an hour already, her arms burning with exhaustion, but the woodpile was nearly empty, and winter in Cimarron, New Mexico, showed no mercy to widows who could not keep their fires burning. The year was 1878, and life had become a relentless series of impossible tasks since her husband died 6 months ago, leaving her alone on this small ranch with nothing but debts and determination. Violet had woken at 4 in the morning, as she did every day now, knowing that sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. The ranch was failing. The cattle had been sold off one by one to pay creditors, and all that remained was this small cabin and the few chickens that scratched in the yard. She was 23 years old and felt ancient, her hands calloused and rough, her face wind-burned despite her attempts to shield it. The axe felt heavier with each swing, and she knew she was doing it wrong, that the blade was striking at the wrong angle, but there was no one to teach her and no time to learn properly. She did not hear the rider approach, did not see the man dismount his horse and stand at the edge of her property, watching her struggle in the pre-dawn darkness. She did not know that Franklin Baines had been riding past her ranch every morning for the past 2 weeks, always finding some excuse to take the long route into town, always hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman he had seen once at the general store, the one with eyes like storm clouds and a bearing that spoke of pride despite her worn dress and tired face. Frank was 26, a ranch hand at the sprawling Double J spread that bordered her property to the north. He had come to New Mexico 3 years ago from Texas, running from a past that involved a father's gambling debts and a brother's mistakes, seeking a fresh start in territory that asked few questions. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that always seemed too long and hands that knew the language of rope and leather and hard work. He had never been good with words, had never been the kind of man who courted women with poetry or promises, but he knew when something mattered, and this woman mattered in a way he could not quite explain. He watched her take another swing, watched the axe glance off the log and nearly fly from her grip, and something in his chest tightened. She was going to hurt herself, or worse, and there was no one around to help her. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the town of Cimarron was 4 miles down a dusty road that became impassable when the winter storms rolled in. He should ride on, should mind his own business, but his feet were already carrying him forward, and his hands were already reaching for the axe. "Madam, you are going to take your foot off if you keep swinging like that," he said quietly. Not wanting to startle her too badly, Violet spun around, the axe clutched in her hands like a weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. The darkness made it hard to see his face, but she could make out the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low over his eyes. For a moment, fear spiked through her, sharp and cold, because a woman alone was vulnerable in ways that kept her awake at night. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What are you doing on my property? My name is Franklin Baines. I work at the Double J. I have been riding past here on my way to town, and I could not help but notice you were out here every morning, chopping wood before dawn." He kept his distance, kept his hands visible, understanding the fear he saw in her eyes. "I did not mean to frighten you. I just thought maybe you could use some help." "I do not need help," Violet said automatically, though her arms were shaking and her back ached and she knew she was lying. "I can manage just fine on my own." Frank nodded slowly, though he could see she was barely managing at all. "I am sure you can, madam, but the thing is, I am up early anyway and the Double J does not need me until after sunrise. It would not be any trouble for me to split some wood for you. Save you some time and effort. I told you I do not need help, Violet repeated, but her voice was softer now, and she lowered the axe slightly. Pride was a heavy thing to carry, but she had been carrying it for so long that she did not know how to set it down. Yes, madam, I heard you, Frank said gently. But sometimes accepting help is not about need. Sometimes it is just about letting someone do something kind because they want to, not because they think you cannot do it yourself. Violet stared at him, trying to make out his features in the darkness. There was something in his voice, something genuine and without pity, that made her throat tighten. She was so tired all the way down to her bones, and the thought of not having to swing that axe one more time was almost overwhelming. "Why would you want to help me?" she asked, suspicion warring with hope. "You do not even know me." "I saw you in town a few weeks back," Frank admitted. "You were buying flour, and you counted out every penny twice to make sure you had enough. I asked around, found out your husband died and you were trying to keep the ranch going on your own. I have been where you are, madam, trying to do everything alone because asking for help feels like admitting defeat. But it is not. It is just being human." Violet felt something crack inside her, some wall she had built to keep the world at bay, and she found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "All right," she whispered. "If you want to chop some wood, I will not stop you, but I cannot pay you." "I am not asking for payment," Frank said. He stepped forward carefully, reaching for the axe, and she handed it over with trembling hands. "Why don't you go inside and get some rest? I will have this done before you know it." Violet wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying and watching, but her body was making the decision for her. She nodded again, feeling dazed and strange, and turned toward the cabin. She paused at the door, looking back at the stranger who was already positioning a log on the chopping block with easy confidence. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling rusty and unfamiliar. "You are welcome, madam," Frank replied, and then he brought the axe down in a clean, powerful swing that split the log perfectly in two. Violet went inside, meaning to stay awake and keep watch, but the warmth of the cabin and the exhaustion that had been building for months pulled her under almost immediately. She collapsed onto her bed without even removing her boots, and sleep claimed her like a dark tide. When she woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and panic seized her immediately. She never slept past dawn, could not afford to waste the daylight, and she scrambled out of bed with her heart racing. She rushed to the door and flung it open, expecting to see the woodpile still depleted, expecting to have dreamed the whole encounter. Instead, she found a neatly stacked pile of split wood, enough to last her a week at least, maybe more. The stranger was gone. His horse and presence vanished as if he had never been there at all. For a moment, Violet wondered if she had imagined him, some fever dream born of exhaustion and desperation, but the evidence was right there in front of her, solid and real. She walked over to the woodpile, running her hand over the smooth, split logs, and felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had done something kind for her, so long since she had felt anything other than alone, that this simple act of generosity threatened to undo her completely. She did not see Frank watching from the ridge above her property, did not know that he had stayed to make sure she woke safely, that he had been fighting the urge to knock on her door and make sure she was all right. He told himself he needed to ride on, that he had work waiting, but he knew he would be back tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, because something had shifted in him when he saw her sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knew how long. The next morning, Violet woke at 4 again, determined to get to the woodpile before her mysterious benefactor. She dressed quickly in the darkness and hurried outside, only to find him already there, his horse tied to her fence post, the axe already swinging in the pre-dawn light. "You came back," she said, and he turned to look at her, his face partially visible now in the faint light. "I said I would help," Frank replied simply. "I am a man of my word." Violet wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the cold. "I cannot keep letting you do this for nothing. It is not right." Frank set down the axe and turned to face her fully. "If it makes you feel better, you could make me some coffee. I have been up since 3, and the trail is cold this time of morning." It was such a small request, so reasonable, that Violet found herself nodding. "Coffee I can do. Come inside when you are finished." She went back into the cabin and started a fire in the stove, grateful for the wood that made it possible. She put on a pot of coffee, measuring out the precious grounds carefully, and then started making biscuits from her dwindling supply of flour. If he was going to work for her, the least she could do was feed him properly. By the time Frank knocked on the door, the cabin was warm and fragrant with the smell of fresh biscuits and strong coffee. Violet invited him in, suddenly self-conscious about the sparse furnishings and worn curtains, but he did not seem to notice or care. He removed his hat respectfully and sat at the small table when she gestured to a chair. "You did not have to go to all this trouble," he said, eyeing the biscuits with obvious appreciation. "It is no trouble," Violet said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "And you have done far more for me than I have done for you." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, and then Frank took a bite of biscuit and closed his eyes briefly. "This is the best thing I have eaten in months," he said honestly. "The cook at the Double J makes everything taste like saddle leather." A smile tugged at Violet's lips despite herself. "I find that hard to believe." "I swear it is true," Frank said, and there was a glimmer of humor in his dark eyes. "Old Pete has been cooking for the ranch for 20 years, and I think his taste buds died sometime around 1865. Violet laughed, a sound she had not heard from herself in so long that it startled her. Frank's expression softened at the sound, and something warm unfurled in his chest. "You have a nice laugh," he said quietly. "You should do it more often." The words hung between them, intimate and startling, and Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks. She busied herself with her coffee, not knowing how to respond, not understanding why this stranger's opinion should matter to her at all. "I should get going," Frank said, standing and reaching for his hat. "The boss will be expecting me soon. Will you come back tomorrow?" Violet asked before she could stop herself, and then felt embarrassed by her own eagerness. "If you want me to," Frank said carefully, watching her face. "The woodpile could use more," Violet said, which was not really an answer but was as close as she could come to admitting she wanted to see him again. "Then I will be here," Frank promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Frank would arrive before dawn, chop wood while Violet slept or pretended to sleep, and then they would share coffee and whatever breakfast she had managed to put together. They talked during those morning meetings, careful conversations at first that slowly deepened into something more substantial. He told her about Texas, about the brother who had gotten into trouble with the wrong people, about the decision to leave everything behind and start fresh. She told him about her late husband, a kind man but a dreamer who had invested their savings in a silver mine that never produced anything but debt, about the struggle to keep the ranch when everyone in town told her to sell and move back east where women like her belonged. "What does that mean, women like you?" Frank asked one morning, his eyes sharp with interest. "Women who cannot handle ranch life," Violet said bitterly. "Women who should be in parlors drinking tea and doing needlepoint, not trying to survive out here." "Do you want to do needlepoint and drink tea?" Frank asked. Violet laughed. that sound he had come to treasure. I would rather be dragged behind a horse. No, I love it here despite everything. I love the space and the sky and the way the mountains look at sunset. I love knowing that what I do matters, that if I work hard enough I can survive on my own terms. I just wish it was not quite so hard. Frank nodded slowly, understanding more than she knew. You are not alone anymore, he said quietly. I know we have not known each other long, but I want you to know that. Whatever you need, whatever you are facing, you do not have to do it by yourself. Violet looked at him across the table. This man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray, and felt something shift in her heart. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this awareness that she was beginning to care for him, that his presence had become the best part of her days. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Really doing this?" Frank held her gaze, and his answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Because from the moment I saw you, I could not stop thinking about you. Because you are the strongest person I have ever met, and I want to be part of your life in whatever way you will let me. Because I think I am falling in love with you, Violet Thornton, and I do not know what to do about it except show up every morning and hope that maybe, someday, you might feel the same way." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with possibility and fear. Violet's hands trembled around her coffee mug, and she could feel her heart beating so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "I barely know you," she said, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "Then let me court you properly," Frank said, leaning forward with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Let me take you to the church social next week. Let me introduce you to people as the woman I am courting, not just the widow everyone pities. Let me show you that there is more to life than survival." Violet wanted to say yes so badly it frightened her. She had loved her husband in a comfortable, familiar way, but this feeling that was building for Frank was something else entirely. Something fierce and consuming that made her feel alive again after months of merely existing. "What if people talk?" she asked, grasping for objections. "What if they say it is too soon, that I am being disrespectful to my husband's memory?" "Then they can talk," Frank said firmly. "Your husband has been gone 6 months, and from what you have told me, he was a good man who would want you to be happy. And if anyone has something to say about it, they can say it to me." There was a protective edge to his voice that sent warmth flooding through Violet's body. When was the last time someone had wanted to protect her, to stand between her and the harsh judgments of the world? "All right," she said, the words tumbling out before courage could desert her. "Yes, I will go to the social with you, but Frank, I need you to understand something. I am not looking for someone to rescue me. I do not need a hero. What I need is a partner, someone who sees me as an equal, not as someone to be pitied or saved." "I have never thought of you as anything other than my equal," Frank said earnestly. "You have been running this ranch on your own, dealing with grief and debt and every kind of hardship, and you are still standing. That is not someone who needs rescuing. That is someone I would be honored to stand beside." Violet felt tears sting her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "You should get to work," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are going to be late." Frank stood, but he hesitated at the door, turning back to look at her. "Violet, I meant what I said, every word." "I know," she whispered. "That is what scares me." After he left, Violet sat at the table for a long time, her coffee growing cold, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had not expected this, had not been looking for love, had convinced herself that chapter of her life was closed forever. But Frank had opened a door she thought was locked, and now she could not stop thinking about what might lie on the other side. The weak, until the church social passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety. Frank continued to come every morning, chopping wood and sharing breakfast, but there was a new awareness between them now, a charge in the air that made every interaction feel significant. He told her about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, a small spread where he could run cattle and horses and build a life that was truly his. She found herself imagining what it might be like to share that dream with him, to build something together instead of always struggling alone. On the day of the social, Violet spent hours trying to make herself presentable. She had one good dress, a dark blue calico that she had not worn since her husband's funeral, and she brushed it carefully to remove any dust or moth damage. She pinned her honey-colored hair up in a style that had been fashionable a few years ago, knowing she did not have the money for ribbons or combs to make it more elaborate. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror that hung above her washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. There was color in her cheeks for the first time in months, a brightness in her gray eyes that spoke of hope rather than just endurance. Frank arrived at exactly 4 o'clock, riding his horse and leading a gentle mare he had borrowed from the Double J. He dismounted and stood staring at her for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his expression one of almost reverent admiration. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Violet replied, taking in his clean shirt and neatly combed hair. He had even shaved, and she found herself missing the rough stubble that usually shadowed his jaw, though she would never admit it. The ride to town was quiet but comfortable, their horses walking side by side along the dusty road. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and the mountains rose in the distance like sentinels guarding the valley. Violet breathed in the clean air and felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. The church social was being held in the large meadow behind the white clapboard church, and by the time they arrived, dozens of people were already gathered, families spreading blankets on the grass and setting out baskets of food. Children ran and played, their laughter carrying on the breeze, and someone had brought a fiddle and was tuning it in preparation for dancing later. Violet felt her anxiety spike as they dismounted, and Frank helped her down from the mare. She could already see people turning to look, could imagine the whispers starting, the speculation about the widow Thornton and the ranch hand from the Double J. "Hey," Frank said softly, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "It is going to be fine. I am right here with you." His confidence bolstered her, and she lifted her chin and walked beside him into the gathering, refusing to look ashamed or uncertain. Several people greeted them, some with genuine warmth and others with thinly veiled curiosity. Frank introduced her to some of the other hands from the Double J, young men who treated him with respect and her with courteous friendliness that eased her nerves. They found a spot to spread the blanket Frank had brought and set out the food Violet had prepared, simple fare but made with care. Other families drifted over to talk, and Violet found herself relaxing as the conversations flowed easily. Frank stayed close, his presence a steady comfort, and she caught him watching her several times with an expression that made her heart flutter. When the fiddle music started and couples began to dance, Frank stood and offered her his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Thornton?" "I am not much of a dancer," Violet admitted, but she placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the makeshift dance area. Frank pulled her into the traditional position, one hand at her waist and the other clasping hers, and began to move with surprising grace. "Just follow my lead," he said near her ear. "I have got you." They swayed and turned to the lively music, and Violet felt a joy she had not experienced in years bubble up inside her. Frank was smiling down at her, genuine and unguarded, and she realized with a start that she trusted him completely. This man who had appeared in her life like magic, who had asked for nothing and given everything, had somehow become essential to her happiness. "I am glad you convinced me to come," she said as they spun, her skirts flaring out around her legs. "I am glad you said yes," Frank replied. "I was terrified you would turn me down." "Why would I turn you down?" Violet asked, genuinely curious. "Because you could have any man you wanted," Frank said seriously. "You are beautiful and brave and capable, and I am just a ranch hand with nothing to offer but hard work and a heart that belongs entirely to you." Violet stumbled slightly, and Frank caught her easily, steadying her against him. They stood still in the middle of the dancing couples, their eyes locked, the world narrowing to just the two of them. "You have more to offer than you know," Violet said, her voice fierce with emotion. "You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever. You have reminded me that life can be more than just surviving, that there is still kindness and goodness in the world. That is worth more than all the money and land in New Mexico." Frank's grip tightened on her waist, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her right there in front of everyone. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers briefly, a gesture so tender it made her throat ache. "I want to marry you, Violet," he said quietly, urgently. "I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to help you save your ranch, want to build a life with you, want to wake up every morning knowing you are beside me." Violet's breath caught in her chest, and she felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible over the music. "Yes, Frank, I want that too." The joy that transformed his face was almost painful in its intensity. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing, and she clung to him and laughed too, feeling lighter than air. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her, slow and sweet and full of promise, and she kissed him back with all the hope and love that had been building inside her. Around them, people cheered and clapped, the sound breaking through their private moment, and they pulled apart, both flushed and grinning like fools. An older woman Violet recognized from the general store came over, smiling broadly. "It is about time someone put a smile back on your face, dear," she said warmly. "Your husband was a good man, but he would not want you to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving. You deserve happiness." The words, coming from someone in the community rather than just Frank, gave Violet permission to let go of the last of her guilt. She had loved her husband, would always remember him fondly, but he was gone and she was still here, still living, and she had every right to embrace this new chance at love. The rest of the evening passed in a golden haze. They ate and danced and talked with neighbors, and Frank kept her hand clasped in his as if afraid she might disappear. When the social finally wound down and the stars were bright overhead, they rode back to her ranch in comfortable silence, both processing the enormity of what had happened. At her cabin, Frank helped her dismount and then stood holding her hands, reluctant to leave. "I should get back to the Double J," he said, though his tone suggested he wanted to do anything but stay, Violet said impulsively. "Not in the cabin," she added quickly, feeling her cheeks heat. "But you could sleep in the barn. It is late and the ride back is long." Frank hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and desire. "Are you sure? I do not want to damage your reputation." "My reputation survived you chopping my wood every morning for weeks," Violet pointed out. "I think one night in the barn will be fine. Besides, we are engaged now. That makes it more acceptable. Frank grinned at that, loving how it sounded. Engaged, he repeated. I like that. He settled his horse in the barn and made a bed for himself in the hay, and Violet went into the cabin feeling strange and wonderful and terrified all at once. She changed into her nightdress and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her for hours. Her mind kept replaying the evening, the dancing and the kiss and the proposal, and she found herself smiling into the darkness like a girl half her age. The next morning, she woke to find Frank had already been up for hours. He had not only chopped wood, but had also repaired the broken fence rail she had been meaning to fix for weeks, and cleaned out the chicken coop. When she emerged from the cabin, he was washing up at the pump, his shirt off despite the morning chill, and she stopped dead at the sight of him, lean muscle moving under tanned skin, water droplets catching the early light. He looked up and saw her staring, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, reaching for his shirt. "Morning," Violet managed, feeling flustered and aware of him in a way that was entirely new. "You have been busy." "Could not sleep," Frank admitted, pulling on his shirt. "Too excited, I suppose." "I kept thinking about everything we need to do to get the ranch back on its feet." That snapped Violet back to reality. "Frank, about that. I appreciate everything you have done, but I need to be honest with you about how bad things are. The ranch is mortgaged to the bank, and I am 3 months behind on payments. I have sold everything I can sell, and even with your help, I do not know if we can make enough to satisfy the debt." Frank came over to her, his expression serious. "How much do you owe?" Violet named the figure, and he whistled low. "That is a lot, but it is not impossible. I have some money saved up, about half of what you need. We could use that to make a payment by ourselves some time." "I cannot take your savings," Violet protested immediately. "What if something happens? What if the ranch fails anyway? You would have nothing." "If the ranch fails, we will still have each other," Frank said firmly, "and we will start over somewhere else. But I do not think it is going to fail, Violet. This land is good, the location is solid, and with 2 of us working it, we can make it profitable. We need cattle, though, a good herd that we can build on." "Cattle cost money we do not have," Violet pointed out. "Then we borrow it," Frank said. "Or we work out a deal with one of the bigger ranches. I could talk to my boss at the Double J, see if he would be willing to let us run some of his cattle on shares. It is done all the time. We care for them, and when they sell, we split the profit." Hope flickered in Violet's chest. "Do you really think he would agree to that?" "Only one way to find out," Frank said. "Let me go talk to him today. In the meantime, I think we should set a wedding date. The sooner we are officially married, the sooner we can start working together without people gossiping about impropriety." Violet nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "The circuit preacher comes through in 2 weeks. We could ask him to perform the ceremony." 2 weeks, Frank repeated, his eyes lighting up. "I can wait 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity and planning. Frank talked to his boss at the Double J, a gruff but fair man named John Chisholm, who agreed to the cattle sharing arrangement after Frank explained the situation. Frank used his savings to make a payment to the bank, which bought them 6 months of breathing room. Violet cleaned and repaired the cabin, trying to make it a home worthy of a husband rather than just a shelter for a desperate widow. The wedding itself was small and simple, held in the little church in Cimarron with only a handful of witnesses. Violet wore her best dress again, and Frank had purchased a new shirt for the occasion, dark blue that matched his eyes. The preacher spoke about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage, and when Frank slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Violet felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit back together. "I love you," Frank said as they stood together in front of the altar. "I will spend the rest of my life proving it." "I love you too," Violet replied, and she meant it with everything in her. "Thank you for finding me, for not giving up on me." They kissed to seal their vows, and then they were married, bound together in the eyes of God and the law, and Violet had never felt more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first months of their marriage were hard but happy. They worked from dawn to dusk every day, tending the cattle that John Chisholm had entrusted to them, repairing fences and buildings, slowly bringing the ranch back to life. Frank proved to be an excellent rancher, knowledgeable about cattle and horses in ways that surprised Violet. He taught her how to rope and brand, how to read the weather and the land, how to turn a struggling homestead into a thriving operation. At night, they would collapse into bed exhausted but content, and Frank would hold her close and talk about the future they were building together. He spoke of expanding the herd, of buying more land, of the children they would have someday, and the legacy they would leave behind. Violet listened and believed, her faith in their shared dream growing with each passing day. By the end of the first year, they had made enough profit from the cattle to pay off another chunk of the mortgage and purchase a small herd of their own. The ranch was no longer failing but thriving, and Violet walked her property with pride, knowing that every fence post and every head of cattle represented their combined effort and determination. It was in the spring of their second year of marriage that Violet realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to hope, afraid to tell Frank in case she was wrong. But when the signs became undeniable, she sat him down at the kitchen table one evening and took his hands in hers. "Frank, I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then a grin broke across his face so wide it looked like it might split his cheeks. He let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around just as he had done at the church social all those months ago. "A baby," he kept repeating, setting her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby." "Violet, this is the best news I have ever heard." She laughed at his enthusiasm, feeling her own joy bubble over. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Frank cupped her face in his hands, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I am beyond happy. I am blessed. I have you, I have this ranch, and now we are going to have a child. I never thought I would have any of this, never thought I deserved it, and you have given me everything." The pregnancy was not easy. Violet suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, and the summer heat made her uncomfortable and swollen. But Frank was attentive and patient, taking over the heavier ranch work and making sure she rested when she needed to. He would sit with her in the evenings, his hand on her growing belly, talking to their unborn child and making plans for the future. In the late autumn of 1880, their son was born, a healthy baby boy with Frank's dark hair and Violet's gray eyes. They named him Samuel, after Frank's grandfather, and the moment Frank held his son for the first time, Violet saw something in his face that made her fall in love with him all over again. He was gentle and awed, cradling the tiny baby like he was the most precious thing in the world. "Hello, Samuel," Frank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I am your father, and I promise you I will do everything in my power to give you a good life, to teach you right from wrong, to show you what it means to be a man of honor and integrity." Violet watched them together, her husband and her son, and felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. This was her family, her life, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The years that followed were filled with the everyday joys and struggles of ranch life. Samuel grew into a curious, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about cattle and horses, and the land that would someday be his. Frank taught him to ride when he was barely 4 years old, and Violet's heart was in her throat watching her little boy on the back of a gentle mare. But Frank was patient and careful, and Samuel took to it like he was born in the saddle. When Samuel was 3, Violet became pregnant again, and this time she carried the baby with more confidence and less fear. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1884, a beautiful girl they named Grace. She had Violet's honey-colored hair and Frank's infectious smile, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. The ranch continued to prosper. They expanded their herd, purchased more land, and built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Frank proved to be not just a good rancher, but a respected member of the community, serving on the town council and helping neighbors when they needed it. Violet ran the household with efficiency and grace, balancing the demands of motherhood with the responsibilities of the ranch. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Violet back to the meadow where the church social had been held, the place where they had first danced, and where he had first told her he wanted to marry her. They spread a blanket on the grass while the children played nearby, and they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange. "You remember that night?" Frank asked, his arm around her shoulders. "I remember everything," Violet said, leaning into him. "I remember being terrified and excited and hopeful all at once. I remember thinking that you were either going to save my life or break my heart, and I did not know which was more likely." "And which did I do?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You saved my life," Violet said simply. "In every way that matters. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again, and you gave me a family and a home and a future. I do not know what I did to deserve you, Franklin Baines, but I thank God every day that you rode past my ranch that morning and decided to stop." Frank kissed her temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "I was the one who got lucky. You could have told me to mind my own business and leave you alone, but you gave me a chance. You let me prove myself, let me love you, and that has made all the difference in my life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children chase each other through the grass, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Samuel was 7 now, tall and sturdy for his age, with his father's confidence and his mother's determination. Grace was 3, all dimples and curiosity, fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified Violet. "I want more," Frank said suddenly, and Violet looked at him in surprise. "More what?" "More of this." Frank gestured at the meadow, the children, the life they had built. "More years with you, more memories, more of everything. I know we have been blessed beyond measure, but I cannot help but want more time, more moments like this." Violet smiled and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We have the rest of our lives," she reminded him gently. "And I plan to spend every day of it loving you and building this life we have created. Promise me something," Frank said, turning to face her fully. "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter what challenges we face, we will face them together. That we will always remember this feeling, this happiness, and fight to protect it." "I promise," Violet said solemnly. "Together always." They sealed the promise with a kiss, and then Samuel came running over, demanding that his father play tag, and Grace toddled after him, and the moment shifted from romantic to chaotic in the way that life with small children always did. But Violet would not have changed it for anything. As the years continued to pass, the ranch grew into one of the most successful operations in the area. Samuel showed an aptitude for business and was already talking about ways to expand and diversify, while Grace proved to have a gift with horses that amazed even her father. Frank and Violet grew older together, their hair graying and their faces weathering, but their love for each other never dimmed. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and pursuing their own dreams, Frank and Violet would sit on the porch of their home and watch the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to keep. Frank would take her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after so many years, and they would sit in companionable silence, content in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and true. "You ever think about that first morning?" Violet asked one such evening, her voice soft with memory. "When I was out there in the dark, trying to chop wood and failing so miserably." "I think about it all the time," Frank admitted. "I think about how close I came to just riding past, to minding my own business and never stopping. And then I think about everything I would have missed if I had made that choice, and it terrifies me." "But you did stop," Violet pointed out. "You saw someone who needed help and you offered it without expecting anything in return. That is who you are, Frank. That is why I fell in love with you." "And you were brave enough to accept help," Frank countered. "Brave enough to let me into your life, to take a chance on love again when you had every reason to protect your heart. That is who you are, Violet. That is why I will love you until my last breath." They sat together as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the horses drowsing in their stalls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, and another answered, a wild sound that reminded them they were part of something larger than themselves, part of the untamed beauty of the New Mexico landscape. Samuel came by the next day with his wife and their 2 children, a boy and a girl who reminded Violet of her own children at that age. Grace arrived a few hours later with her husband, a kind man who worked as a horse trainer and treated her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The house filled with noise and laughter, with the chaos of family, and Violet moved through it all feeling grateful and blessed. Frank watched his grandchildren play in the yard where his own children had played, where he and Violet had built a life out of determination and love, and he felt a profound sense of peace. This was his legacy, not just the ranch and the land, but the family he had created with the woman he had loved from the moment he saw her struggling with that axe in the pre-dawn darkness. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Frank and Violet prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of decades together. Frank helped her brush out her long hair, now more silver than honey-colored, and she helped him with the buttons on his shirt that his arthritic fingers sometimes struggled with. They moved in sync, a dance they had perfected over countless nights, and when they finally climbed into bed, Frank pulled her close against him, her back to his chest, his arm draped over her waist. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Violet replied, covering his hand with hers. "Thank you for chopping my wood that morning. Thank you for changing my life." Frank chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest and into her back. "Thank you for making that terrible coffee and those amazing biscuits. Thank you for giving me a reason to come back every morning." They fell asleep that way, as they had for over 30 years, 2 people who had found each other in the darkness and had built a life in the light. Outside, the New Mexico wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and dust and home. The ranch that Violet had nearly lost, that Frank had helped her save, stood solid and prosperous, a testament to what 2 people could accomplish when they worked together, when they loved each other with everything they had. Years later, when they were both old and gray, Frank would tell the story to his grandchildren of how he had fallen in love with their grandmother. He would describe riding past her ranch in those early mornings, seeing her struggle with the axe, making the decision to stop and offer help. The children would listen with wide eyes, enchanted by the tale of their grandparents' romance, and Violet would smile and add her own details, her own perspective on those pivotal days when her life had changed forever. "The important thing to remember," Frank would tell them, his voice still strong despite his age, "is that love is not just a feeling. It is a choice you make every single day. I chose to stop that morning, chose to help your grandmother when she needed it. And every morning since then, I have chosen to love her, to support her, to be the best husband and partner I could be. That is what makes a marriage last, what makes a life worth living. And I chose to let him help me," Violet would add, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I chose to be brave enough to trust again, to love again, even though I was scared. I chose to build a life with him instead of struggling alone. Those choices, made day after day, year after year, are what created this family, this legacy we are leaving you." The grandchildren would nod solemnly, understanding in the way that children do that they were being entrusted with something important, something sacred. And when they grew up and had families of their own, they would tell the story to their children, keeping alive the tale of the widow who was chopping wood in the dark before dawn, and the cowboy who came early and had it done before she woke up, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime. Frank and Violet lived to see their great-grandchildren born, lived to celebrate 60 years of marriage surrounded by the family they had created. When Frank finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, Violet held his hand and whispered that she would see him again, that this was not goodbye but only farewell for a little while. She followed him 6 months later, her heart unable to beat without his, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations, and every new owner was told the story of how it had all begun. The wood pile that Frank had first stacked all those years ago was long gone, but the spot where it had stood was marked with a small memorial, a reminder that great love stories often begin with simple acts of kindness, with one person reaching out to another in a moment of need. And on quiet mornings, when the sun was just beginning to paint the sky with light, if you stood very still and listened carefully, some swore you could hear the sound of an axe biting into wood, and the laughter of two people who had found each other in the darkness and had built a life together in the light. It was a sound of hope and love, and the enduring power of human connection, a sound that would echo through the New Mexico landscape for generations to come.